welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders of Tomorrow. Today we have with us Yasin Sharif, the co-founder of Travel Stall and Modern Classroom. Welcome, Yasin.
Thank you so much.
So let's begin. Okay, so my first question to you is, how did you venture into the travel industry and what drew you to it?
It's a family-run business. So my dad and his brothers actually started Labak Tours and Travels, and we are pioneers in the Hajj and Umrah business. We've been in the trade for over a couple of decades and one of the best in the country today. Right out of college, I was a little young to get into the Hajj Umrah business. I thought back then. So I remember this one day I was at the mall and I was coming down and I saw this kiosk. It was a very nice kiosk. It was so far ahead of its time that they actually had to put a gentleman there to explain how to use it. So it was an ATM machine for flight tickets.
Cool.
And I remember it belonged to Flight Raja back then. And then, long story short, I spoke to the gentleman and he gave me Mr. Vinay Gupta's number. And I've been very fortunate throughout the 10 odd years I've been at travel. I've got very good mentors, and Vinay Gupta was one of them. He was the CEO of Flight Raja, and I think it became Wire.com, etc. And today he runs a company called Trip Factory. Okay. So I went and met him, and a couple of hours into the conversation, I became his first white label partner. And at that point of time, I had no knowledge about technology, but I was very inclined. So I quickly ran back and he just said, listen, you need to get me a domain name and a web hosting, etc., etc. And that didn't make any sense to me back then. Again, a friend of mine came to my rescue, Anas Siddiqui, and I went to him and he helped me with all of it, and we set up travelstall.com. And again, it was a B2B venture wherein we partnered with travel companies, the non-IATA agencies who could probably, go ahead, book tickets across the counter with their brand. I was in college back then. I remember I was in my first year BCom, and I finished college at around 11 o'clock. And then after which I would take my bike and my laptop and head to different agencies trying to explain to them, listen, this is what it is and you should partner with me. I went to all the hotel travel desks because I saw that those guys had these hotels, they had travel desks, but they did not have a facility to book tickets. So I went to them, and I remember the first month of sale on Travel Stall was 6,000. The second month of sale was 6 lakhs, and on the third month I was doing almost about 60 lakhs. And I was in college and I was doing this. I would get calls, and that's how it all began, and we set up travelstall.com. Very important is, I would say, all schools, colleges, etc. teach you how to be a businessman, how to be successful, do all of that, but no one teaches you what happens when you fail. So I think I peaked in about 3 years. Travelstall.com was doing extremely well, and after that the market commoditized to such an extent that business became difficult. And that's when we started looking at options. And I remember a friend of mine was getting married then, and he came to me and said, listen, will you be able to book my honeymoon package for me? And I'm like, sure. I had no clue what it was. I said, sure, let's just do it. And that's how we got into it. And I remember we did Sri Lanka and Maldives. That was the first destination I sold, and he came back really happy. And then I was like, not that difficult. Seems nice. I think we can do this. And that's when we started doing a lot of honeymoon travels. So we practically became honeymoon specialists. I remember at one point of time, Trip Factory, again, because of Mr. Vinay Gupta, he was, SpiceJet had a tie-up with them. And every client or any client who booked a flight ticket to Maldives, he or she would then get a request for an accommodation. And pan-India, all the accommodation requests to Maldives came to us. And we became specialists at Maldives in setting honeymoons, and we were doing at one point of time almost about 50 room nights just to Maldives. Saw all the islands there, traveled back and forth, and that was a good story. And then unfortunately, I think SpiceJet shut down for a day, and then that didn't continue, and that's how the Modern Classroom came about.
Wow. So could you tell us a little bit more about Travel Stall and the Modern Classroom? Like, how did you decide to venture into the education space?
Right. So the minute we started doing well at Travel Stall, we figured that there is a wide scope for travel in terms of the vacations, in terms of honeymoons, etc., etc. Again, I just feel that I've been lucky. A lot of things have just happened when things started going south for me. My current partner, Mr. Khan, it's a funny story, they call him KK. He's called KK because he's been to the Kennedy Space Center, I think about 55 odd times. So no one at the Kennedy Space Center could say Mahabubullah Khan, so they nicknamed him Kennedy Khan, and that became KK. So he's actually a father's friend, and he came to the office talking about from Umrah visa. And then my father introduced him to him, and then he said, listen, I've lived all over the world, we've been to the Kennedy Space Center, can you, do you think we can work something out? And thankfully at that point of time, because of my Hajj Umrah business, majority of the affluent school owners did travel with us. And then we took the idea to them. It took 7 months, I think, to convince our first school. And then when we did convince them, we had about 125 kids who traveled to the US. Then it went to 375, 500, more than 1,000 kids on average is what we do now. So.
Great. So how important do you think travel is in the education space, like for children to travel? And
it's our mantra. So the reason the modern classroom, so when we started off with Travel Stall. And we very soon realized that when we went to schools who did not know us, they looked at us in a very, not a very positive way. They would look at us and say that, oh, you're a travel company. I mean, there are like 5 other travel companies, give me your best rate or give me your best quote and we'll get back to you. I didn't like that attitude because I was not any other travel company. Simply because we understood over the period of 10 odd years that when you travel, different age groups have different interests, and based on those interests, when you have different programs, it's relative to them. So that's why we started the modern classroom as a separate entity altogether, because as a traditional travel company, you had a few limitations. You could not do a few things. Whereas as the modern classroom, you could do a lot more. So that's why we started the modern classroom and said, listen, our focus is going to be 11 to 17-year-old kids, and we are going to complement the traditional methods of teaching in schools, take it outside the confines of a traditional classroom, wherein now, and make sure that whatever we do is permanent, is fun, that wherein the kids go enjoy, and it's relative. So that way, we at least believe that what we were doing is par none. And then slowly over a period of time, I think schools have recognized that and have started working with us quite closely.
Great. So you started off really young, like you said, in the travel industry. How do you think when someone like you starts off young, and so when they spend some time in the business, they're still fairly younger than the older generation? How do you think young leaders like yourself can actually bring about change in the industry?
I mean, the best thing, for someone who's young, is that we don't have fixed mindsets. As long as you're willing to change, I think you will you'll enjoy doing whatever you're doing with travel especially. What I did realize very early is that in order to be successful, in order to be profitable, it's better for you to focus on one particular thing rather than doing multiple things, right? So in the travel trade, I keep telling a lot of people, if you are jack of all, master of none, you will survive. But if you are a specialist and if you are great at one thing and extremely good at it, then you'll thrive. And for me, 10% of a watermelon was always better than 90% of a grape. So I said, okay, so let's just focus on what we're doing and doing it great, and then people will come because of that one thing, and that is enough to take care of it. So
great. So in today's day and age, there's a lot of discussion about bringing about a more sustainable outlook in the travel industry, when especially people travel so much, like millennials, and they want to be more mindful of the kind of carbon footprint they leave. And how do you think the travel and tourism industry can actually be more sustainable in that way?
Okay, so in general, what others are doing towards this, I don't know. But at the modern classroom, what we do is we believe that you need to start young. So if you look at our programs, initially when we started out as a company, we had one product. From one product we went to 10 products. Ergo, we came back and then we understood that, listen, even with this, because of the cost component, we are still working with 10% of the children of the school only. The 90% are untouched. Then we started domestic programs, and then those started doing extremely well as well. And after doing those, we came back and they said, few parents might not be very comfortable sending them overnight. So if you all can come up with a program which lasts a day. And we said, why not? And then we built day programs, and we've got quite a few day programs focused on sustainability. We have this one program called Pot to Plate. It's an association with a very close friend of ours, and here we explain to a child the entire life cycle of a plant from pod to plate in one day. It's basically, I think if you're a CBSE student, it's 3-4 chapters in a day, all practically done. Now what happens is, when these kids actually go through the entire life cycle in a day, they understand how difficult it is, and in terms of wastefulness, in terms of how whatever the farmers undergo in terms of putting food on your plate, etc., etc. And on all of these programs, we try and incorporate at least one sapling being sent back home with a child. So in a year, if I'm working with about 2 lakh kids, and even if 10% of those take something back and put it back onto the and it works, then I think it makes a difference.
Okay, so my final question to you is, what advice would you give to younger leaders who aspire to join the travel industry at some point?
No, I mean, I've taken this from Jack Ma. I remember in one of his interviews he said, don't join a big company. The minute you pass out of your college, the aspiration is, who picked me up? Did I get into, I'm not going to name the big companies, but I want to get into a big company. It's the biggest mistake you can do. Simply because it's great to be there. I have nothing against those companies, but those are process-driven companies. And when you are fresh out of college, and if you are fresh out of graduating tourism, if you do not know the different kinds of things you can do, then you're not going to enjoy doing it, right? I've been an entrepreneur since day one. I remember I keep telling my father, I mean, if I had a son like you, and if we had to trade places, I would have been very upset with you, because he told me when I joined business, go work outside. Learn, understand, then come back. And I did not listen to him. I said, no, I'm not going out. I sat down, I lost quite a bit of his money and he was nice enough to say, don't worry beta, cost of learning. And that's one thing I learned. Right. So when we began, I remember I was in my own office, and in my office no one taught me, because I just felt a lot of them were threatened back then, older times, and it took me time to learn. And because I was able to do that, I could then decide and define and say, you know what, this does not interest me. I think I'm better off at that. Let me focus on that and then get someone else to do this who's better off at that job. So you then are, I mean, it puts you in a better position to understand what you enjoy doing. And then from there, you can then decide how you want to move on. But in travel, I just think everyone should become an entrepreneur, because travel allows you to do that.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yasin. It was great chatting with you. Sure. Thank you for watching. For more such content, please like, share and subscribe to The Dough.